Let me know when it's about 10:30 to another weapon, because we were talking 25 to 30, so let me know when it's been 20 minutes, and then I will know. Because I can speak. I can certainly speak. Big deal. Here.
What? Good? Okay.
We can tell your law students you're so used to being quiet once the professors walk in to the classroom. That practice you just exemplified there. But on behalf of the Sports and Entertainment Law Society, the West Virginia University College of Law, we would like to welcome you here today. My name is Robert Dixon. I'm an Executive Vice President of the Sports and Entertainment Law Society, and thank God I'm a 3L student here at our College of Law. And I have the pleasure today of performing three, I wouldn't call them tasks, I will call them privileges. And that's giving you some background on how we got here for this fine event today, and then introducing two of the favorite people in my professional life. Last year, we had the pleasure of sponsoring and executing an event called Reversing Field, an examination of commercialization, sports, and law in the 21st century. And that was a two-day symposium. We brought in a vast amount of professionals, practitioners, and experts on various issues from commercialization to race in sports, the steroid debate, women in sports, and so forth. And in bringing our professors and practitioners, one professor was not able to come due to an unfortunate, untimely death in his immediate family. So that laid the stage for this event this year when that professor said, I want to come and I would like to engage your College of Law. Thus, we set this event, re-examining 1/3 of that piece we did last year, the state of race in sports. And that is why we're here today. We are here to examine where we've come from as a society in reference to sports and race, where we believe we're currently at, and where we believe the future is going to take us, or what that future perspective looks like. That will be the nature of our discussion here today. You should feel privileged to have the individual sitting before you that will be introduced to you a little later. The historical significance of their contributions to sports and culture goes without saying, and their dynamic speaking abilities and ability to convey to you the thoughts, the actions, and actually what their pulse was during this fabulous event you will see in a few minutes. On to my next task, which is a tall one, and that's introducing our fine dean. Dean McConnell has been with us since 1995. She's been with the College of Law for 12 years. And I could stand here all day long and list the many accomplishments that she's had as a professor, as a scholar in her area, her publications. But I will not do that. She is a Georgetown-educated practitioner. She got her JD from Antioch College and her Bachelor's of Arts from Evergreen State. She's served as a faculty member here, served as associate dean, and she teaches, well, used to teach first-year property law, is a strong advocate for women's rights and domestic violence, has taught such things as natural resources, land use planning. The nationally recognized scholar we have the pleasure of having in our presence every day, and I implore you to interact with her on more than just a grade change, or can I get credit for going to Brazil, or something along those lines. She's received many awards, like I said, and it's my pleasure today to bring to you the People's Choice, our new dean, Dean McConnell.
I humbly accept the People's Choice Awards. Welcome to West Virginia University College of Law. Thank you, Rob, for that wonderful introduction. I also want to welcome our guests here this morning before I make some very brief remarks. I want to start by saying that in 1968, as a 15-year-old living in Washington, D.C., watching the Olympics, I could not have imagined that I would actually meet Dr. John Carlos. That is a moment for me, seeing him on the Olympian stand, taking a position for justice, which was so much in my mind at the time and in the minds of so many other Americans. It was during a time of a great struggle for racial equality. And as a 15-year-old, to see Dr. Carlos take that position was a moment that in some ways is equal to another moment that this morning makes us remember, which is September 11th, 2001. I know that this is a day that we all remember. I call upon us to remember it as a day similar to the day that Dr. John Carlos took that amazing position and demonstration for justice, which is that when we think about September 11th as lawyers, it is a call to us to remember how important it is to remember our current struggle for justice, for the protection of the rights of all people, and the protection of those rights for justice in terms of privacy, in terms of judicial rights, the rights to trials that are fair trials, open trials, transparent trials, the things that our nation stands for, that we are proud of and want to be a part of. And so one of the things that we can look to on September 11th is not just what was done to us, but what it is to us as a nation and a people and as members of this profession, which is a call to protect the rule of law and to make sure that we are fulfilling our role to make sure that justice is available for all persons. Now that we remember that day and we can see that iconic moment that Dr. Carlos is captured in that amazing photograph, we can begin again today to think about the progress that has been made since 1968, and we can also think about the progress that is yet to come and the role that we will all play in achieving that progress. So I welcome Dr. Carlos here not only because he joins all of us, but because he's fulfilled something that I guess I couldn't have ever dreamed. I'd also like to welcome Professor Tim Davis from Wake Forest. Professor Davis was supposed to join us last year and unfortunately could not, but we're delighted to have you here with us today. And I talked to Dr. Davis briefly before my opening remarks, and he told me that he's going to focus substantially on race, not only politically in the United States through history, but also the way in which it mirrors itself in the development of sports and athletics. And so thank you very much, Professor Davis, for being with us today. And of course, I'm glad I can't welcome Professor Cummings because he's with us all the time, which is our great privilege. And I'm so happy to have Professor Cummings here, and I want to thank him for working and advising the Sports Law Society and making sure that this program is being held here at West Virginia University College of Law. And finally, I would like to recognize Ms. Bethany Swanton for all of her work on behalf of the Sports Law Society, and particularly for putting today's program together. And thanks to all of the Sports Law Society members. You all do a wonderful job. We deeply appreciate the programming that you bring to the College of Law. Thank you, and welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being here with us today, and I know you'll enjoy the program.
Thank you again, Dean McConnell. And I failed to recognize several of the staff that are here, and I would like to say welcome. Several other university professors and professionals are here, and thank you to everyone that helped us put this event together, from the flyers and the posters to strategic planning to the electronic devices provided here, the images and everything. I'd like to thank and welcome everyone. Now I have the pleasure of giving you a rundown of, like I said, my next favorite person in my professional life, Miss Bethany Swanton, who is, of course, a proud West Virginia native and avid sports fan that grew up in a strong sports and educated family. She received her Bachelor's of Science here at WVU in sport management, and unfortunately got lured to be an Ohio State University intern. It's so great for a professional career, but she loses points personally. And she returned to us and made it here in the College of Law, and had the fabulous opportunity last summer to serve as a CBS Broadcasting Incorporated summer legal intern in Hollywood, California, with a former WVU law graduate, and that was a fabulous opportunity for her. Currently, she is serving as a legal intern with the Pittsburgh Pirates, which she drives up 3 times a week in managing her studies here. So as a fine leader and president of our organization, the Sports and Entertainment Law Society, I bring you now our moderator, Bethany Swanton.
Wow, thanks, Rob. Good morning and welcome to everyone. I have the honor of introducing our panelists today. We are very lucky to have with us 2 of the foremost scholars in the areas of race, sports, and the law, as well as one who has just been regarded as one of the leaders in the nation's civil rights movement, and Dr. Carlos. Speaking first today will be Professor Andre Douglas Pond Cummings, who, as you all know, is a professor of law and the advisor to the Sports and Entertainment Law Society here at our College of Law. Originally from Los Angeles, Professor Cummings graduated from Brigham Young University, where he participated on the university's track team, and later received his JD from Howard University, where he graduated cum laude and with high distinction. Prior to joining the WVU Law faculty, Professor Cummings worked as a judicial law clerk as well as an associate at the Chicago-based law firm of Kirkland & Ellis. While employed at Kirkland & Ellis, Professor Cummings represented clients in the sports and entertainment industries, including professional football athletes, musicians, screenwriters, record labels. Professor Cummings has published numerous articles in connection with sports and equality, including articles discussing the Rooney Rule in the National Football League and the inappropriate use of American Indian mascots and imagery by professional and collegiate athletics teams. Professor Cummings was named the 2007-2008 Professor of the Year by the graduating class of 2008 from last year's law school. Speaking after Professor Cummings will be Professor Timothy Davis. He is the John W. and Ruth H. Turnage Professor of Law at Wake Forest University School of Law. Regarded as one of the foremost experts on the intersection of race, sports, and the law, Professor Davis is the co-author of Sports Law and Regulation, Cases, Materials, and Problems, and The Business of Sports Agents, as well as numerous articles. In addition to his publications, Professor Davis serves on the review board for the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, is a member of the Board of Advisors for the National Sports Law Institute, and is the former chair of the Law and Sports section of the Association of American Law Schools. Prior to teaching at Wake Forest School of Law, Professor Davis taught for 9 years at Southern Methodist University, and prior practiced commercial litigation in Denver, Colorado. And lastly, we have Dr. John Carlos, the bronze medalist in the 200 meters from the 1968 Summer Olympic Games in Mexico City. Though a gifted athlete, it was his political activism that has catapulted him into celebrity status. Dr. Carlos became a founding member of the Olympic Project for Human Rights, which initially was created to organize a boycott of the 1968 Olympic Games. Though the boycott never occurred, he, along with fellow U.S. sprinter and gold medalist Tommy Smith, engaged in a silent protest during the medal ceremony, protesting against racism and economic depression for all oppressed peoples. The infamous pose of two African Americans bearing no shoes and raising their fists to the sky has become a picture synonymous to human equality. Dr. Carlos was inducted into the U.S. Track and Field Hall of Fame in 2003 and is the 2008 Arthur Ashe Award for Courage, recognized at the ESPN ESPY Awards. And we will now start with Professor Cummings.
I'm grateful to the Sports and Entertainment Law Society for putting this event together, for the support of Dean McConnell. I'm particularly grateful to Bethany Swatton and Rob Dixon, who have really been terrific leaders of our organization. I'm grateful to Brian Caudill, to Margaret Obush, to Louis Mackley and Keith Walton, and especially to Kim Murphy, my wonderful research assistant that helped me put these remarks together today. I'm deeply honored to be sitting between Dr. John Carlos and Professor Tim Davis. Much like Dean McConnell mentioned, this singular act has had a dramatic influence on my life, and as I've gotten to know Dr. Carlos a little bit in the last 24 hours, I understand the global impact that this singular moment has had on lives across the world. And it's pretty amazing to be sitting here with one of the foremost experts on sports and race in the United States. Those of you taking sports law next semester will get to read cases out of his casebook. And Dr. John Carlos, who is a personal hero. So today, since many of you get to hear me all of the time, I'm going to keep my remarks brief. But if you believe that, that's good. I wanted to talk for just a few minutes on what I've been thinking and writing a lot about in the last couple of years, which is this. Despite professional and collegiate athletic teams now being dominated by African American athletes, a continuing lack of African American representation in the power positions, in decision-making positions in professional and collegiate sports persists today in an unforgivable and mind-boggling way, in my opinion. We have made progress since the 1950s, but we continue to struggle with the vexing question of power and how it is allocated in sports in America. As Rob mentioned, this is a follow-up on our Reversing Field, Examining Commercialization, Labor, and Race in 21st Century Sports Law symposium that we did a year ago. And progress has been made in a year, but we are still so far behind in where we need to be in equality in professional and collegiate athletics. The plight of the black athlete in the United States professional and collegiate scene reflects a historical road burdened by strident discrimination, yielding assimilation, and gleeful exploitation. As African American athletes began to be permitted to enter the lineups of professional storied sports clubs and collegiate athletics in the 1950s, they did so only on the strict conditions placed upon them by the status quo white male-dominated regime. Often the very terms of black athlete participation required a rigid commitment to covering racial identity and outright suppression of self. Once African American athletes burst onto the nation's consciousness in the forms of Jesse Owens, Jackie Robinson, Althea Gibson, Kenny Washington, Chuck Cooper, Bill Willis, Sweetwater Clifton, Marion Motley, Wilma Rudolph, and Muhammad Ali, white America responded in a way that can only be described as both enthralled and terrified. Tracing through the past 50 years, African Americans have been able to join and dominate the ranks of players and entertainers in American sports, but have been resolutely denied admissions as decision makers. In 2008, African Americans, while dominating the fields of play in numbers of talent, still represent only a sliver of those in power. Scarcely a minority face can be found amongst U.S. professional team owners, general managers, or amongst collegiate presidents and athletic directors and head coaches. Many powerful men and women have spoken out in connection with this dearth of minority representation amongst American sports power brokers, including spokespersons both sublime and unrestrained. It's easy to see, in my opinion, at first glance, how far we've come. Remember, it wasn't until the 1950s and 1960s, and I hope that Dr. Carlos and Professor Davis touch on this. It was only in the 50s and 60s where black athletes began to be permitted to play on collegiate and professional sports fields. And in just 50 years, we have come to a place where those that have been given the opportunity dominate in the fields that they've been given the opportunity to participate in. It's easy to see that some of these barriers have been broken down. My message today is not one of pessimism. Anyone that knows me knows that that's not my message. It's a message of progress made with distance still to cover. And so I hope in my few minutes to talk a little bit about that progress and to talk about what we have left to do to overcome what I view as obstacles. Progress made. 69% of the NFL are African American players. That's the National Football League. Nearly 70% of all players that we cheer on Sundays are African American. Nearly 80% of all players in the National Basketball Association are African American. And in college athletics, more than 50% of all Division I student athletes are African American. Compare that to the 1930s, 40s, 50s, where 0% of these athletes were African American. That's true progress. That's an as equal as we can get playing field for athletes, right? Because it's important for colleges and professional sports teams to field the best teams that they can on a bottom line profit basis, which allows athletes of great talent to compete. We've made progress in the covering aspect, and I wanted to talk for just a minute or two about that. Professor Kenji Yoshina at Yale talks about this civil rights doctrine called covering. He says that to cover is to tone down a disfavored identity to fit into the mainstream. In our increasingly diverse society, all of us are outside the mainstream in some way. This is Professor Yoshino. Nonetheless, being deemed mainstream is still often a necessity of social life. Famous examples of covering abound. Ramon Estevez covered his ethnicity when he changed his name to Martin Sheen, as did Krishna Banji when he changed his name to Ben Kingsley. Covering is a hidden assault on our civil rights. We have not been able to see it as such because it has swaddled itself in the benign language of assimilation. But if we look closely, we will see that covering is the way many groups are being held back today. The reason racial minorities are pressured to act white is because of white supremacy. My argument is that Jackie Robinson, Jesse Owens, and Althea Gibson were forced to cover. In order to break barriers, they had to suppress self in order to allow white mainstream America to get comfortable with the idea of an African American dominating fields of play. However, think of this, if you can, as progress. Chad Ochocinco, or Chad Johnson, who just changed his last name to Ochocinco. Those of you that don't know, he's number 85 on the Cincinnati Bengals, which isn't really Ochocinco. It's something like, I don't know. Yeah, that's 85. But Chad Ochocinco is being referenced by sportscasters as Chad Ochocinco. And those of you that know him know that he's allowed his personality. He's flamboyant in a way that Jesse Owens and Jackie Robinson could never be. Not that I guess their personalities were, his personality was such. But athletes today, Terrell Owens, Chad Ochocinco, Venus Williams, they don't have to cover today. They can be themselves, still find endorsements. That's progress. I guess it's arguable whether Chad Ochocinco's progress, but he doesn't have to cover in order to be successful as an athlete. One of the reasons that I'm so proud to be sitting here next to John Carlos today is because in 1968, he and Tommy Smith refused to cover, refused to assimilate. Professional owners and presidents and college presidents. We have made progress in that Bob Johnson is the first African-American principal majority owner of a men's major sports franchise. He owns the Charlotte Bobcats. He put a group together with Michael Jordan, and we have our first African-American owner of a sports franchise. That's progress. The NBA has 7 black top executives among its 30 teams. That's 23%. In 2007, of 117 positions for collegiate Division I presidents, 4 were African American. That's progress. Although I think you'll agree with me, that's not enough progress. For professional general managers and head coaches in the NFL, a record number of African American head coaches at 7 led NFL teams last year. That's nearly 23%. That's progress. The number of general managers in the NFL is now 5. The general managers, for those of you that are not familiar, make the decisions. They shape the teams. They negotiate rosters. They make trades. 5 are African American. That's a record. Although in a league that's 70% African American, it's still a dismal percentage of 18 or 19%. One of the reasons that the NFL has had success in hiring head coaches and general managers is the Rooney Rule, which was adopted by Paul Tagliabue, the commissioner of the league, was led by Dan Rooney, the president and owner, still I think, of the Pittsburgh Steelers. And it requires NFL owners to interview one minority applicant for every head coaching position that's available. When I conclude in a few minutes, I'll tell you why that's important and why the law can have an impact on these disparate numbers. As far as collegiate athletic directors and head coaches, it's pretty bad. Of 117 NCAA Division I football teams, there are only 7 black head coaches, although more than 50% of the athletes are African American. That's a problem, I think, a serious problem. But I'm here to say that we've made some progress. We've made progress because of activists. We've made progress because of scholars. We've made progress because the Rooney Rule and other legal types of avenues have been pursued, and that progress has been important and outstanding. If you'll remember, 2 years ago, Super Bowl 41, head coach Tony Dungy and head coach Lovie Smith, for the first time, led NFL teams to the Super Bowl, and African American was the first head coach of a Super Bowl winning team. Well, what are our obstacles? Why is there still a problem with African Americans moving into positions of power? Head coaches, athletic directors, owners, general managers. It's the same tired excuse of the old boys network. It's who we know, how we know them. There are hundreds and hundreds of coaches in the NFL and the NBA that are retread, meaning they fail in their previous position, but because they know the owner of another sports franchise, they get another opportunity. Norv Turner, the head coach of the San Diego Chargers, has never succeeded as a head coach. He's had losing records in every head coaching position he's ever had. He's coaching the San Diego Chargers now on his third team, if not fourth, because he knows owners who are principally white, who typically hire who they know. Another reason that there hasn't been more progress is because it's only been 50 years, maybe 40 in some instances, that African Americans have been able to play these sports. And many times, individuals that become general managers or head coaches are athletes that have played the sport. And the pool, because of racism and discrimination, was for a long time limited. And so those are a couple of the reasons that we have obstacles that continue today. I want to conclude with what I think are some solutions or solutions and conclusions going forward. One, I think it's optimally important that 70% of African American athletes in the NFL, 50% of African American athletes in NCAA collegiate athletics have an opportunity to be coached by African American coaches. I think it's an important psychological and lifetime impact that coaches can have on players, and the foreclosure that's been in place for these positions must be broken down. The Rooney Rule was adopted by the NFL. The NCAA, under pressure, has just adopted a similar type of best practices guideline that suggests now that African Americans not be given positions, but be put in play by allowing white owners, white college presidents, and white athletic directors to be exposed to up-and-coming, talented African American coaches, general manager candidates, and assistant coaches. The only way the Old Boy Network breaks down, in my opinion, is when the Old Boy Network is forced to go outside of the box and be introduced to and meet candidates that they did not know previously. The Rooney Rule, adopted by the NFL and enforced by Commissioner Goodell and Commissioner Tagliabue, as I mentioned before, requires that for every open position, a minority candidate be interviewed. Let me give you a quick concluding example. When Bill Cowher resigned as head coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers, everybody thought that Ken Wisenhunt or Russ Grimm would be the next head coach. They were assistant coaches. They knew the owners, the Rooneys, well, but the Rooneys followed the Rooney Rule, thankfully, and interviewed a couple of minority candidates, but one that they just heard of, didn't know anything about, but just heard of, Mike Tomlin, a young assistant defensive coordinator for the Minnesota Vikings. The Rooneys admitted that had they not interviewed Mike Tomlin, they would not have seen the quality, the extraordinary planning and talent that he presented, and would have probably hired who they knew, Wisenhunt or Grimm, rather than the extremely talented, and we'll see this season, successful head coach Mike Tomlin of the Pittsburgh Steelers, formerly of the Minnesota Vikings. It's about exposure. It's about activism. It's about awareness. It's about exposure. And my hope is that as we've made progress in the United States on the playing field with African American athletes and minority athletes of all races and ethnicities, that we can begin to make substantial progress in the fight for power positions as we increase exposure and require the good old boy network, not the good, the old boy network, to break down in a way that can be truly historic and significant. Finally, when individuals take stands, when they write controversial articles, when they stand on medal stands and raise their fists, when ordinary men and women decide to make a difference and to take a stand, profound things can happen. And I think Tim Davis and John Carlos are evidence of that today. And I hope that we can use our discussion today to move equality in the sports law context forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cummings. We'll listen to Professor Davis.
It is quite a pleasure to be here today. I'd like to thank the Sport and Entertainment Law Association, Professor Cummings and your dean for the invitation and no doubt the support that you provided for this symposium. It's also a pleasure to be in Mountaineer Land, notwithstanding the fact that a few years ago, your basketball team did a horrible thing to the Chris Paul-led Wake Forest team. It still hurts, all right, but nevertheless, I will certainly overlook that, and it is still a pleasure to be here today. I'd like to talk a little bit today about race in sports from a historical perspective. Indeed, one of the first articles that I wrote focused on race in sports. And I recently thought, what would be an interesting thing to do would be to once again look at race in sports from a historical perspective, but from a slightly different angle. And that angle proceeds as follows. Sociologists say that sport represents a microcosm of society. You hear that stated in all types of sociological literature involving sports. And I thought it would be a useful exercise to just trace that and see if what was happening in the larger society was mirrored in what happened in sports, particularly as it relates to the participation opportunities of minorities. What I'm going to do today is focus on the experiences of African Americans, and that is not intended to suggest that other racial minorities have not been subject to different types of racial discrimination historically in sport. But I just want to focus on that experience of the African American athlete today. And I'm not sure if I may need some technical assistance here. And if you trace the experiences of African Americans in sports, the historical experience, let me go back. Probably start with this premise of sport being a microcosm of society. And what you find is if you go back to the slavery era, you see that what was occurring in society was also mirrored by what was happening in sports as well. And you saw that whites were in control. Blacks were in subordinate positions, and that was certainly mirrored in the role that blacks played with respect to sporting activities. Indeed, blacks participated in various types of sports, horse racing, boxing, and their participation was oftentimes or typically for the entertainment of the slave owners. And African Americans would typically engage in these sporting activities as a part of festivals. And even though it was in some sense a joyous period for them, it allowed them to interact with family members when they would not oftentimes have other types of opportunities and venues to do that. Some were critical of that, even Frederick Douglass, who said that it was really a way of trying to placate them. and trying to diminish the horror of what they had to deal with on a daily basis. He was particularly critical of the fact that at these festivals, oftentimes alcohol played a large role. And so he said it was just a way of diverting their attention from the place that they found themselves in and the struggle that they had to or should have been trying to pursue. We moved to the Reconstruction era. And those of you who have studied this and perhaps in your common law classes and other classes know that it did produce some changes for blacks in society overall. There was greater access to education, to medical care, and some doors were open for African Americans during the Reconstruction era, in particular because in the South, focusing again on the South, because African Americans had access to political office. They were able to do some dramatic things, for instance, with respect to abolishing some of the slave codes. And what you find is that this progress that you saw with respect to the Reconstruction era occurring in society overall, you also saw that some venues were opened up for African American athletes as well. And I characterize this as a period of limited inclusion. And you saw blacks, and many of you may not know this, but they achieved a great deal of notoriety in various sports. Maybe you may know of some of the boxers from that era, but there were blacks who were on baseball teams. In fact, Jackie Robinson broke the racial barrier in professional baseball, but I like to characterize that as the reintegration of sports because of the Walker brothers who played in the 1880s. Were members of the Toledo Mud Hens, and Isaac Murphy won the Kentucky Derby. And so there were these limited participation opportunities for blacks during the Reconstruction era, just as things improved overall for blacks, but on a more limited basis. But what you also saw, as was happening in the larger society, is that notwithstanding increased access, there was discrimination that athletes had to deal with both on the field as well as off the field. I mean, there were baseball players on minor league teams who were fired simply because a white teammate said, we're not going to play with that particular athlete. So those are the sorts of things. And again, limited inclusion because sport did remain largely segregated during this era. The other area is post-Reconstruction, which is actually a very sad era in American life overall, in American society overall, because what you saw was the systematic exclusion of African Americans from many spheres of American life. In the doors that had been opened up during the Reconstruction era were closed firmly shut during the post-Reconstruction era. It was the consequence of numerous factors, efforts that were made to disenfranchise African Americans. Also, since we are in a law venue, you should understand the role that the law played. The law played a very dramatic role in subjugating and subordinating and limiting access to African Americans during the post-Reconstruction era. And what you also saw is the exclusion that was occurring in American society overall was also occurring in the sports realm. And what you saw was that African Americans were excluded from sports participation in the South, for the most part, with the exception of perhaps boxing. But over time, they were certainly excluded. And you saw that various rationales were offered to try to explain the exclusion of African Americans during this era. And this quote from Professor David Wiggins, a sports historian, I think really sums it up. And that is that they were viewed as being inferior. They could not handle, blacks were viewed as not being able to handle the rigors of competitive society overall, but also the competition that existed in the sports realm. I'd like to give you a couple of examples of what happened with respect to the post-Reconstruction era, just to highlight it, and with respect to a couple of sports. One was horse racing. The leading jockeys during the Reconstruction era were actually black jockeys. But something dramatic happened during the post-Reconstruction era, and that is that they completely disappeared from the scene. And there were various reasons for that. Owners and trainers wouldn't hire them. White jockeys would gang up on them. And they were in the jockey club, which ran horse racing, the business of horse racing, refused to re-enlist them. And William Roten, in his book published a couple of years ago, said the following: black riders became victims of the jockey syndrome or changing the rules to fit a need, the need to maintain and control in the face of a perceived challenge to white supremacy. What he means by that is that they became victims of their own success. Because if you're successful, even though the societal expectation is that you're inferior and you cannot participate on an equal basis in competitive activities, well, your success contradicts that. And so they had to deal with that particular phenomena as well. The next slide also focuses on what happened in professional baseball. And you go back to 1887, where the first of these gentlemen's agreements was promulgated that excluded African Americans and dark-skinned Latinos. It is very interesting, the experience of Latinos, because if you were fair-skinned and could, in essence, pass as being white, you could participate, but if you were dark-skinned, you could not participate. And this was a period, particularly in the 1880s, when those players who did participate, for instance, on minor league teams, were subjected to a great deal of abuse. Abuse both from fans as well as their teammates. And one of the interesting aspects of these gentlemen's agreement is that they really did carry the weight of contracts. I mean, they were rigidly enforced. And the first commissioner of any of the professional sports leagues in the United States, Judge Kennesaw Landis, said there was no problem, that there was no racism that existed, no rules that forbid African American or black players from participating in sports. And what you have with respect to baseball, you have to think that baseball was the dominant sport in our society at that particular point in time. And what happened in baseball was followed by football and professional basketball. And you'll see that also that once baseball reintegrated, subsequently the other leagues followed the path set by baseball in that area as well. And again, some of the rationalizations that were offered by Major League Baseball were that blacks lacked the requisite talent. Again, the notion that blacks were inferior. Integration would lead to discord amongst players. What's interesting about this particular point, a newspaper conducted a survey in the 1930s of baseball players, white baseball players, and the vast majority of them said they would be willing to play with black baseball players. And I find that fascinating because there were some well-known racist baseball players, Ted Williams and some others, but at the same time, there were also, at least if you take this, I believe the truth of this survey, that the players were responding in a truthful manner, they said they would be willing to play with baseball players. So a lot of these rationalizations, I mean, obviously, blacks have the requisite talent, were not based on fact. They were certainly not based on fact. Also, there was the sense that, or the belief that integration of baseball teams would lead to problems, and the problems particularly in the South, because where were the minor league teams located? They were located in the South, and there were actually laws in both state as well as local ordinances in many southern states and towns which actually forbid blacks and whites from interacting in sports. And so perhaps this was the one legitimate concern that they had with the minor league teams being located in the South, that they would, in fact, violate local laws. Then there was the concern that fans would not support integration in the sense that if there was an influx of black baseball players, they would take over, the black fans would follow, and the white fans simply would not want that high degree of racial interaction. And then we move to with respect to the Post-Reconstruction era, that's professional sports. We see the same thing is going on in college sports. And that is in college sports, we have in the South, the Southern experience, you have to divide and the Southern experience or distinguish the Southern experience from the Northern experience, because the Southern experience was one where blacks did not participate at predominantly white institutions because of Jim Crow laws and the types of ordinances and laws that I mentioned previously. The Northern experience was actually a very interesting experience because there were some blacks who participated on predominantly white northern institutions. But even those who participated had to deal with both informal and formal agreements, the type of gentlemen's agreements that, as they were called, that you saw in professional baseball. And now some of these informal agreements said that blacks could not participate at northern universities on their sports teams. Others said that they may participate, but we're going to set quotas. We're going to limit the number who can participate. And there were other issues that arose as well. For instance, if a northern team that had perhaps one black player on that team went to play a southern team, or if in some instances, if the southern team came north, they would not play the black player because the southern teams would protest that. And also there was the isolation. It was very clear that those blacks who did participate on northern teams tended to be isolated. Oftentimes they could not room with whites. They were not integrated into the overall university experience. And then there was the phenomenon of stacking, something that you may be familiar with, where blacks were slotted into certain positions, those positions that were viewed as requiring a high degree of physical acuity, but requiring very little in the way of mental acumen. So favorite positions in football, for instance, would be wide receiver, but not a quarterback or a center. Those are viewed as the thinking positions. With respect to baseball, outfielders, but they would not be able to be a pitcher or a catcher or even a second baseman or shortstop. Those are viewed as the thinking person's positions on the field. And let me just spend a couple of minutes talking about the African-American response to segregated sports, because in society overall, and again, mirroring what was happening in larger society, the African-American response to this segregation in the Post-Reconstruction era in America overall was to develop our own institutions. For instance, you had the National Bar Association, which mirrored the all-white, at the time, American Bar Association. You saw the same thing with respect to Bankers Association, Medical Association, even Mortuary Association. And you saw the same thing happening in sports. The black response to segregated sports was to form black-led and black-run sports organizations. So again, you see the mirroring in sports what is happening in the larger society. Then we move on to the post-World War II era, and you see a lot of progress beginning to happen in society overall, and that was a result of numerous factors. You see many of them listed here. The impact of World War II. I mean, and that cannot be understated, because World War II had a tremendous impact. You had black soldiers returning from overseas who had fought against a totalitarian regimes coming back to the United States and starting to really question and assert themselves against the racism that they were experiencing. You also had something else occurring as well. That was a shift and a change in the mindset of many white Americans. And this really started, from what I can tell, in the 30s, moving on into the 40s. They became much more accepting, and they were willing to engage in much greater interaction with African Americans. So this sort of a societal change in the mindset of white Americans was critically important as well. But you see other reasons for that underlie the change in the things that were happening in society overall. Now, how was that mirrored in sports? Well, what you saw in sports in this post-World War II era was the early stages of what I call reintegration. And you had African Americans begin to gain access to those sports that were previously segregated. I had mentioned baseball. Baseball was followed by football. Football was followed by, I think, tennis, and then basketball, and then some other sports as well. But even though there was this reintegration, there were still barriers that were erected. Some of the things I talked about before with the northern teams in the post-Reconstruction era, the artificial limits, the quotas on the number of blacks on teams, the positional stacking, and things of that nature. How would I characterize what I consider us to be in now the post-integration era? And I think, and I share what Professor Cummings said in this regard, is that there has been tremendous progress, dramatic progress, particularly dramatic progress on the field But what's happening in society overall? I think that there's been tremendous progress for African Americans in society overall as well in the post-integration, sort of the post-civil rights era. Doors are certainly opening up, but there still is the problem of racism. And the reason for that, most scholars would say it's not a matter of overt racism. I think that in society overall, we've moved beyond a point to some extent, to a large extent, of overt racism. I think most of us view that as being abhorrent. And if you read about the surveys that are taken, most people do not believe themselves to be racist. And I agree with that. Most people in this country are not racist. Yet at the same time, we continue to be impacted by these biases that we have. And so racism persists in society overall, but also in sports as a result of what can be characterized, and it's characterized in different ways. Some call it attributive bias, cognitive bias, unconscious racism, but it's all premised upon the notion that we make assumptions about individuals and about individuals who fall within certain groups. And oftentimes those assumptions are negative assumptions, and it impacts the way in which we interact with people and the decisions that are made. Let me just share with you one quote from a study that was published in 2005. And what it looked at were the entry-level positions in team sports. And as Professor Cummings pointed out, you have integration at the entry-level positions. Those are the players, but not in the management level. And the authors concluded as follows, that at the managerial levels of professional sports, subconscious racism combines with institutional complexity, which increases the difficulty of measuring candidates' relative qualifications and limits opportunities for African Americans. The decision-making process for managerial positions is replete with ambiguity and uncertainty. This uncertainty encourages the use of stereotypes, attributions, and decision-frame biases to simplify this subjective decision process. These biases work to the detriment of minority managerial candidates. What they're focusing on there is that with respect to entry-level positions, those are the players, teams are going to select the players who are going to help them win. And in so doing, they can look at objective variables. For instance, how many touchdowns did a football player make when they were in college? But when you move up to the managerial level, you don't have the same type of necessarily objective criteria that comes into play. And the more subjectivity that is involved in the decision-making process, the more there is of an opportunity for these subtle biases to creep in and to impact the decision-making process. So that's what we're dealing with now. And the other thing that we're dealing with, and this is the focus of the last slide, is that what are we dealing with in this post-integration era? What are just some of the illustrations? And I could have made a much longer list, because the unconscious racism, the subtle biases there, but at the same time, you also see race converging with other factors, race converging with gender, race converging with economic and social variables to limit opportunities. For instance, the first point here is, and we've talked about, Professor Cummings talked about the limited opportunities in coaching and administration, but how about Title IX and black women? To what extent have black women really been able to benefit from Title IX in a very limited sense? So what are the reasons for that? Are there racial reasons, or perhaps it goes beyond race? For instance, economic reason, access to different types of sports and things of that nature. You also see racial tensions in the athlete agent industry. Why is it that black players are unwilling to hire black agents as their managers? Is there some vestige of unconscious racism even on the part of black players in terms of who they think will be better able to protect and promote their interests? You know, if you live in a community, I'm from Los Angeles, and even though I haven't lived there in many years, I keep track of what's going on in Los Angeles. I've also lived in Denver, also lived in Dallas. We have large Hispanic communities. In society overall, you see tensions occurring between African Americans and Latinos. And you see the same tensions are reflected in baseball. And so again, you see the mirroring of what's happening in the larger society in sport. Another are the different perceptions. Now, one of the things that you see is that blacks and whites oftentimes will perceive events in society overall as well as in sports differently. And one of the topics I was going to talk about if I'd come last year was Barry Bonds, and I didn't get a chance to talk about that. But at the same time, that's one illustration. For instance, the surveys that were surveys that were taken Barry Bonds with respect to his home run chase, with respect to his alleged steroid use. It was very interesting because blacks and whites had very different perceptions and views with respect to Barry Bonds. So again, these are the ways in which you continue to see race acting as an issue in sports. Unlike Professor Cummings, I am very optimistic, and quite frankly, as I look out at you all and my students, one of the reasons that I'm very optimistic is I think that many of you are far beyond overt racism, but I think you're also moving beyond a lot of the implicit biases that you have. And so one of the reasons I'm optimistic is not only because of perhaps laws and using the law as a means, but also because of young people and thinking that you all will really lead the way in making these changes as you become more aware of the various things that impact how you think about individuals and particularly individuals from different groups in our society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Davis. Before we introduce Dr. Carlos, I briefly mentioned in the biography that a brief biography. I told him earlier it was impossible to write a paragraph on his life. He received the 2008 Arthur Ashe Award for Courage at this year's ESPYs. And we have a clip from the ESPYs, a little introduction that was done before Dr. Carlos accepted his award that we'd like to share with you first.
(1968), the year Bill Russell, the NBA's first black head coach, led the Celtics to a world championship. Bob Gibson won the Cy Young Award. Denver's Martin Briscoe became the first African-American starting quarterback. They played in a country that applauded their efforts on the field, yet denied them equality off the field. 1968 may have been 40 years ago, but for many of us like me, a 19-year-old college student at the time, the events are so vivid, so personal, they could have occurred yesterday. As thousands of lives were lost in Vietnam, decades of discrimination and oppression exploded into streets filled with poverty and rage. This would lead to a bold action by two members of the United States track team, Tommy Smith and John Carlos.
Tommy Smith was the seventh of 12 children born to immigrant farm workers in Clarksville, Texas. His earliest memories are of working the fields with his family, struggling just to have food on the table. John Carlos was raised in the city, in the hard streets and poverty of Harlem.
Their backgrounds may have been different, but they united to make a statement before the eyes of the world. As Arthur Ashe himself said, I respected the way they stood tall against the sky and insisted on being heard on matters other than track and field, on matters of civil rights and social responsibility. I couldn't help but admire them.
In a turbulent era, they provided a powerful gesture, a silent statement of pride and unity after so many years of racism and prejudice.
It's hard to explain just how violent the 60s were.
You've got to keep the whites and blacks separate.
People moving out, people moving in, because of the color of their skin. But you sure can't hide. Segregation, determination, demonstration, integration, activation, denudation, obligation to my nation.
1968 was a volcanic eruption at almost every level.
That's what the world is today. Hey, LBJ, how many cats you killed today?
In the States, that is the shaking of the foundation of American civilization.
assassinations, Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy.
The whole American culture kind of came unhinged.
After a summer of violence and loss, the eyes of the world turned to Mexico City, site of the 1968 Summer Olympics. The Games began as a new sense of black consciousness had already taken hold among African American athletes. There had been talk of an Olympic boycott, but ultimately the athletes decided against it. Still, many of them felt the need to make a statement for human rights during the Games.
Not a day passed that somebody did not confront you with, what are you going to do? How are you going to do it? We had this platform, this stage. The world was looking at you, so wham, there it is.
People were really kind of nervous, and nobody was more nervous, of course, than these old white Olympic officials. I think that everybody was prepared for something stunning to happen.
But who among them would step up? By day 4, no one had. Then Tommy Smith and John Carlos took their place for the 200-meter final.
There's Questad. It's a good start. And Carlos, as usual, has burst out of the blocks. Tommy Smith running pretty well so far. And in lane 2, Bombuk is strong on the outside. It's Edwin Roberts. It's John Carlos right now. It's Carlos and Smith. And here comes Tommy Smith. Smith has done it with his hands in the air.
Tommy Smith had set a new world record. In the tunnel, before the medal ceremony, few words were spoken. They walked to the medal stand with their shoes off to symbolize the poverty of their youth. Tommy Smith accepted the gold medal. John Carlos, the bronze. As the national anthem began to play and the American flag was hoisted, Smith and Carlos bowed their heads and raised a gloved fist into the night air.
My prayer was a prayer of solidarity, a prayer of hope, that we could unite as a people instead of being separatists in a country that's supposed to be one.
Well, once we turned to leave, I really started thinking hard about, the fact that I was a free man, that they could never put shackles on me again.
They didn't want to be thought just as people who could run faster or jump higher.
A lot of people thought that was just black power. No, that was black people affirming their dignity. So it wasn't anti-American. It was anti-injustice in America.
But for Smith and Carlos, the reaction was swift and severe. They were stripped of their place on the team and sent home by their own country.
The International Olympic Committee said you will either take them off the team by 5 o'clock or you will not be in track and field for the last 2 days of the competition.
Smith and Carlos were vilified as militant radicals, but their personal sacrifice had just begun. There would be death threats and hate mail, and long afterwards, isolation and unemployment. Years of desperation and anguish for themselves and those they loved.
Tommy's career couldn't get a job. He ended up moving in with me. He had lost his apartment, his wife had broken up, and he came with a suitcase in his hand.
My parents were being harassed mercilessly. There's real concerns around our safety. So he suffered, and he suffered for years.
It chips away at your manhood. After a while, you get to the point where these things are so prevalent to you, you hate to look at the guy in the mirror in the morning.
It's just amazing how a country can quickly turn, that you want to go medal for your country, and yet as soon as you take that stand and identify yourself as being proud of who you are, then you're condemned.
4 decades ago, Tommy Smith and John Carlos use their moment of Olympic victory to remind America of a greater battle yet to be won. Now at San Jose State, where they train together, there's a statue in their honor. A statue that shines a light on our appreciation for their message of human dignity.
They could just as easily have stood there with their hand over their heart, the national anthem playing in the background, but to represent their country and say, I want to run for America, but I want America to understand who I am. And it took a lot of courage for them to do what they did, a lot of courage.
I think most black would probably tell you that day was a great day for them because it probably gave them some hope that, we're going to be able to overcome.
They were willing to sacrifice themselves for something far greater than a gold medal or a bronze medal.
The fundamental lesson of what they did is courage. Courage to think for themselves. And it's the courage to hope. Because what they did was, this is a sign of hope. And that's a beautiful thing.
Please join me in welcoming Dr. John Carlos.
Thank you. Oh, no.
Thank you so much. Is this thing on? Hello? Hello? Can you hear me in the back?
It's on.
Great. Well, first of all, I'd like to say I'm honored, very honored to be here in West Virginia State University. This young lady, Beth, remarkable. Anytime she can get an individual that's crippled, just come out of surgery, on heavy doses of medication, and still convince you that it's the right thing to come to Western University, West Virginia University. So she's a charm. You guys realize what you have here. And Professor Cummins had the vision to organize this thing. And Professor Timothy over there, in terms of the loss, he anticipated last year for Dr. Cummins, Professor Cummins, to bring this forum back and have me come and join Professor Davis. It's a great opportunity for me to share, to tell you that I don't think I was born to be an activist. Like I wasn't born to be a firefighter either. But if I see a fire, I'm going to do what I can do to try and put the fire out. And I think that's the way all of us are built. I think that's the character that we all have within us. When we look at today, talk about racism and bias and prejudice, this is not something that's instilled in you. When you're born into the world, you don't have these symptoms in you. These are things that's taught to you. They might be taught by your mom, your dad, or your uncle, even by your friends. You talk about social justice. Is it social justice when you went to school and all you hung with was white kids, all you hung with was black kids, or if you was a Hispanic, all you hung with was Hispanic kids? The school perpetrates that, just like the penitentiary perpetrates that. When it runs along those lines, we never have an opportunity to learn about the various cultures that we're involved in, that we have to deal with, live with every day, work with. So it creates this bias and this separation. People have fear, just like that very peaceful demonstration up there. We thought hard and long about what we would do. We thought about a boycott. And I got that idea about the boycott from, a very dear friend of mine, Dr. King. God put me in very strategic places. From 7 years old, he gave me a vision that I was going to be in a stadium and people was going to be applauding about something that I did. And in a split second, the applause turned to anger and venom and bitterness, hatred. And then, I met Jackie Robinson when I was a young man, and he was expressing to me about him as a baseball player going into the major leagues and what he had to endure. One white guy used to be on TV that I was very fascinated by. He used to wear this green. That's probably why I wear green a lot, because he made that my color, because he's an earthly person. But he wasn't concerned about himself. He was concerned about other people who was less fortunate, because they didn't know how to be concerned for themselves. This guy was named Robin Hood. And I think Robin Hood went across the world in terms of all of the underdogs looked up to Robin Hood and said, hey, I'm not concerned about the sheriff of Nottingham. I'm concerned about the well-being of the people. Well, I was truly impressed with this individual. So as a young individual, you know, I used to look around and see people that didn't have. I noticed right away that there was a lot of minority families. When I say minorities, not just blacks, but Puerto Ricans, Jamaicans, or what have you. A lot of them at that time didn't have a two-family situation. You know, back in the 50s, for a black man and a black woman to live together, if they made $15,000 between the two of them, it was living high on the hog. But that was far and few in between, because there was very few times that you would walk into a black household and you would see a mom and a dad together. Because the money that they were earning wasn't enough to support 3 or 4 kids. So therefore, they had to go for public assistance, or as they call it, welfare. In the welfare system, it was so deep until I had to race my mind back to slavery and think about how they would take a family. Let's imagine this. It's a white family. And I come in and I take you away from your wife, take you away from your daughter and your son, put all y'all on the ship, I put you down in the basement of the ship, and I tell you, say, grab that oar, and don't stop until I tell you. And make you row your way to this glorious country called America. And then when you get off the ship, they take you and they shackle you around your neck, shackle you around your wrists and your ankles. And you see as the time they're dragging you one side, you see them dragging your wife to another side, and see you dragging your daughter to another end, and your son to another end. Meaning to yourself, wow, will I ever see my family again? Will I ever see my loved ones again? Never to be. Unless you was fortunate enough at a very bad time to be on the auction block. And it might take your wife up there and rip her clothes off and expose her. Let them see her breasts. Oh, this is a good breeding woman here. To endure all of these things. To feel these things. To think about the Africans that was in the Maiden Passage. That died down in those gullies of the ships. That they just took them and threw them overboard. No one ever said a prayer for them. And then for them to tell me that I had no right to break into a freight train, as Robin Hood would do, because people in my community didn't have food, that was absurd. But then, even though it was absurd, I had to ask the question to myself because of the upbringing that my mom and dad gave me. And that question was, whose law am I really concerned about? Am I concerned about man's law here on earth? Or am I concerned about God's law? See, because when God put the earth down here, he didn't put borders up. He didn't say, show me your passport. He didn't say, hey, man, let me block out and tell you can't watch what's coming through the airspace because ABC or NBC or HBO owned it, pay me $300 a month or what have you. Man came in and did this. The same thing as man did in schools where he separated you. He don't want you to think for yourself. And then when you have the agony and the pain, he doesn't even want to feel that. So as a youngster breaking into these freight trains, my father had to come to me one day on the advice of 2 detectives that was his real good friends. Said, Earl, we think that Johnny's doing some break-ins, and you need to tell. My father stopped him right there. No, you need to tell him. They rolled over by the Yankee Stadium. We should train across the street, park. They blocked the whole park off. I said, what's going on, man? The police around here real tight today. Well, I didn't know they was there for me, for my buddies. But they walked right up to me. I said, Johnny, let me just tell you something. I said, there's been a lot of break-ins going over at the freight yard. We think we know who's doing it. We can't do anything until we catch him. And we're going to catch him. And the minute he said we can't do it until we catch him, I used to think to myself at that time about how quick I would blow away from them and run in the alley. and when they come in the alley, I done climbed up there. Well, you guys use it as a maybe a clothesline pole, it's a utility pole. We use them as clotheslines in New York. And I scurry up the pole. When they come in, where did he go? Where did he go? And I put him push about 3 to 4 feet from the pole. Just push off the pole and turn around and grab one of someone's fire escape and run to their house. What are you doing now, Johnny? So when he said that, I kind of smirked. And Mr. Bryan is he was a tall guy, probably about 6'7", big, robust hands. And Mr. Lester said, he said, John, he said, Mr. Bryan is trying to tell you something. And I said, well, what is he trying to tell me? He said, well, you have a talent. I said, what's that? He said, you're a runner. I kind of smirked at that, like, and Mr. Bryan smacked me on this side of my face, and his hands wound up over here when it was done. Got my attention. I said, Mr. Lester, Mr. Bryan, I'm not trying to disrespect Mr. Lester, but he said, I'm a runner. I'm no exception to that game. I said, everybody in my neighborhood run pretty well. He told me, he said, no, you're an exception. You're a special individual in terms of running. That right there, and the fact that my father said to me, he said, well, if Mr. Lester said that you were running and he gave you a number to call, well, maybe he might have something for that. Call. And I called the New York Pioneer Club. I went back and I talked to my dad, and they told me to come down. And my father said to me, he said, now, son, let me just say something to this in the interim going into this new phase of your life. He said, you remember when you came to me as a little boy and you told me that you wanted to be a swimmer? Because I was a better swimmer than I was a track star, or a boxer, or a basketball player. I had a real passion for swimming. New York City champ, freestyle, 200 meters. When I heard about this guy swimming the English Channel, I didn't know what the English Channel was. I didn't have no concern. But I did have a concern about why is this guy swimming the English Channel? Then when I went and did some research, and I'm saying, well, how is this guy swimming the channel? Is he swimming with a knife in his mouth and fighting off sharks? How does he go to the bathroom when he needs to go to the bathroom? These are questions that I'm putting to my father. My father swam like a rock. He didn't know nothing about no aquatics. So he said to me, he said, well, son, he said, I hear you saying day after day, week after week, year after year, now you're going to the Olympics. And at that time, I wanted to be the first black to represent America in the pool. And my father had to pull me up one day, and he said to me, he said, son, he said, you know, I hear you saying this regularly. He said, it's time that we come to terms with this, and I'm trying to understand what he's saying. He said, you're going to have to pick another sport. And I looked at him, what do you mean, Daddy? I'm going to pick another sport. I'm the best. He said to me, he said, yeah, son, but you'll never have an opportunity to follow your dream in that area. And this is the first real-time discussion my father and I had about race relations or racism. And I said to him, I said, why? And he said to me, he said, well, where would you train? He said, you going to go to the Harlem River? You can't go there. You lose 2-3 guys every summer, which is true. He said, you can't train in the ocean. He said, and you sure can't go to your public pool and train. And I'm saying, well, I'll join up. And he said, you can't join the club because they don't allow blacks there. And then he said, let me give you an example of what I'm saying, son. He said, Colonial Pool was in your neighborhood. He said, Highbridge Pool was up in the white area. He said, when your guys climbed through the mountains to go up to Highbridge Pool, because we used to go up there occasionally, he said, the minute you and your partners jumped in the water, what happened? And it was like motion picture in my brain. I could see it right now while I'm talking about it. As soon as we hit the water, all the white parents jumped up and called their kids out the water. Like it was going to roll off on them or something. And it perplexed me so much because I used to always say, why does the white folks act like they don't like my skin color, but they always laying in the sun trying to get like me? So it's like a crazy world for me. So anyway, I decided that I'll pass up on the swimming and I'll continue on with this track career. Now, I wasn't a studious individual as a youngster. Particularly, I didn't care for school. My thing was to go out and make that money. I knew how to make money. I thought that's what it was all about as a youngster. But then when I got involved in track and field and found that I had an opportunity to go to college and get things paid for, my father, at that particular time when we were talking earlier, he said to me, he said, son, now this is a stepping stone into the next phase of your life. He said, "When you used to steal to give to those that didn't have," he said, "you were a public figure. You were a leader." He said, "but at the same time, you were breaking the law." He said, "Now, if you want to be a spokesperson, if you want to be a civil activist," he said, "if you want to be a leader, everybody likes a winner. So when you start this venture in track and field, be serious about what you're doing." And when he said that, I put it in a little basket. But not until maybe a year or so went by where I started progressing, and then people started putting the microphone in my face to speak. And it dawned on me, now I have a vehicle to get my message across, to let them feel the emotion that people feel. You know, let them know about when I was a little kid and I saw two winos sleeping in the street in New York. They used to have the island running down the street, center of the street. This was a Saturday morning. I don't know, I must have been maybe 10, 11 years old. And both of the winos was out there asleep. As a young white cop came up, nightstick, he'd take the stick, and he'd go to the white guy and he'd nudge him. "Come on, get up, move on." White guy get up, mumbles something, he staggers on off. He goes over to the black guy, and he takes the stick and he bangs the stick on the ground. And the guy didn't move. Well, you sleep and your feet is up in the air. And he took that nightstick, like it was a baseball bat, and water bobbing them shoes out. You ever seen anyone sleep and get shocked or hit? This guy levitated off the ground. And when he came down, he was running across the street. And I was in a state of shock because I couldn't understand why would he go to one guy and do it one way and go to another guy and do it another way. So all of this is in my head in terms of how can we make society be a fair playing field for all people. You know what we call this a fair playing ground? If we have a major flood, tornado, earthquake, fire, then we all come together. Let me help you stop the bleeding. Let me pump some oxygen into you. I love you. You saved my life. And then 6 weeks later, we can revert back to the same old way we were. I don't want my kids playing with your kids. I went to East Texas State University my freshman year in college. I was young. I took my daughter. So much time gone already? Okay. Double time. I took my daughter to college, and my wife went down in 1965 to Dallas Airport, one-room building, Texas Range in the middle. And I walked in, and the first thing I saw inside, white bathroom, black bathroom. And not only did I see the separatist signs, but I saw how they were catering to them. The white bathroom was pristine. The black bathroom had water running and toilet paper all in the doorway. And I'm looking at it. Then I go to the water fountain. They tell me I can't drink out this water fountain. I got to go into the bathroom to get water. And I'm saying, wow, where did I go? Then the coach comes in, and my name changed from John Carlos or Johnny Carlos to Boy. And then it changed to this word called Negro. Well, Negro sounds so much like that other word until I swell up on it. Like, what you call me? And my wife said, I don't think he used the word you thinking. I said, well, it's darn close. Here I am at East Texas State University representing not just East Texas State University, but representing the state of Texas. It says Texas on my chest, all over America, to represent that state. And here I go to the state capitol with two white guys that was on my team. We walk into a bar to get a beer. And I threw the money up on the counter and said, give these guys what they want. I have a beer. I go in the bathroom, wash my hands, come out, they drinking. I'm waiting, where's my beer? And when I asked the guy, he just ignored me. So I said, hey, buddy, you took my money, where's my beer? He looked at me and said, we don't serve niggas in here. And I looked at him, and then I looked at the two white guys who was there, and I'm saying, man, what are you guys drinking? How you drinking, man? I'm spending the money. You drinking, and you don't even have the decency to step up and tell this guy, if you ain't serving him, you ain't serving none of us. Tell me to get on out of here. Well, I had to endure that in school, too, relative to the coach say, I'm representing the school. But if we went down through the South, to Arkansas, anywhere, and we had to stop for meals, oh, you guys, you black guys, stay in the van or stay in the station wagon. and we'll go in and eat, and then we'll bring you something out on the way out. But I don't know how it was prior to me going to East Texas State University, but that's not the way I roll. If I eat, you eat. If you eat, I eat. There's no separatist in being a team. Now, let me tell you about this fist. Everybody talking about fist. You know, and they said it was black power. You know, in the video here, the first time they got it right, they said Olympic Project for Human Rights. It didn't say for black rights or white rights. It said for human rights. And I'm in a race, yes, I'm in the human race. Okay? That's the only race I know. It ain't about racing in track and field. It ain't about civil rights race, like racial issues. It's the human race that I'm more concerned about. And when I sit back and look at society today in terms of how they got so pumped up about two young black individuals saying, hey, you know, we've seen some things in America that we're not too proud about. We've seen things in America that we feel can be better. We didn't go up there with bullets across our chests. We didn't go up there and give the finger. We didn't go up there and disrespect America. All we did was go and say, America has let its conscience go to sleep. Let me tell you what I say about conscience. Anyone in here could be getting beat down. I'm getting ready to go into the stadium because I'm a track guy, and I see somebody kicking you up in your belly or stepping on your head, and I'm walking by and saying, well, that's not my concern because I'm a track guy. I'm going into the stadium. Well, if I walk by that individual and didn't try and stop them from whipping you up the way they're whipping you up, by the time I leave the stadium and come out, they need somebody else to whip up. They're going to jump on me. Those guys that beat Rodney King years ago, there was 25 police involved. 13 of them was beating him down. 12 of them stood on the side and watched. So who's the guilty party? All of them are guilty. Those that stood and watched are even more guilty than the perpetrators. But then again, you sit back and look at the society in which we've grown to be, like as a man being beat with a hammer on the subway, irregardless of what his ethnic background is. Society is so pretentious right now until they run, opposed to running to help, they're running to get away for fear. Oh, it might be me next. They let this man beat this boy down, beat this man down with a hammer with a little baby there watching. And then the guy had to get on the train and take his own self to the hospital because no one chose to help this individual. Well, if we continue that train ride that we're on there, we're in a self-destruct mode. God right now is giving everybody a wake-up call of what we see happening to us in terms of earthquakes. You know, you guys don't remember looking up and say, 70,000 people died, 80,000 people died in natural disasters. What's happening right now with these hurricanes rolling, getting ready to roll through Houston right now? You know, Houston is a very populated area. It's not like Louisiana. If it rolled through there, billions of dollars are going to be wasted there. How's the government going to finance the war at $10 billion a month? And then we're going to have to do the natural disaster thing. How are we going to continue to let society go where the people, the working class people, the grassroots people that make this society roll, can't afford to go to work because they can't afford to buy gas? And we still sit back and think, well, I hope it don't come over to my side of town. But I don't really have no sympathy for them because I can't feel what they feel. You know, it's like this. When I was a kid, if I didn't have food in my house and I knew my mother and father was trying to do everything they could to feed us, and I could sit back and see they wasn't getting a good shake, am I a bad guy because I'm looking around to see whose sandwich I can steal at school? If I can't support my wife or my kids, the guy in the mirror I was talking about in that video, how much love and respect you going to have for yourself when you can't look at yourself and say, I'm the man that I was supposed to be. I'm the man that supports my wife and supports my kids, but I can't get a job. My daughter tell me it's her birthday. She want a dress for her birthday. I can't buy the dress. Or my son come up and say, Daddy, I need some sneakers for my PE class. And I go in my pocket day after day, and all I have is holes in my pocket. And then all of a sudden, boom, in my neighborhood, bootleg liquor went out like King Kong went out, and heroin came in overnight. And you sit back and you say, somebody told him this like they told Billie Holiday. Say, yeah, baby, I know you're going through changes. We driving through the South and you get to see this, but take this. It's going to make you feel better. And we had so many black men and women that was told that, take this, and help you forget about your problems. And then you sit back and you say, yeah, I can use this drug as escapism. I don't want to escape. I want to deal with it. I'm the one to take the bull by the horns. I love all people. I don't care who you are. If you're right, I'm with you. And if you're wrong, I'm against you. It ain't about no color line. It's about whether you earn my respect. And if I earn to get the respect from you, I'm going to demand no less. Thank you for the time.
We are now going to open up this portion of our program to questions from the audience. First, I'd like to thank all of our panelists today. It's truly remarkable having Dr. Carlos here and everybody on the panel, and Professor Davis from Wake Forest. I got to meet him yesterday on the way from the airport, and after a little bit of confusion on finding him, it was a quite an enjoyable ride home, and got to introduce him to Morgantown, West Virginia, which we're proud to have everybody here. So any questions from the audience, just raise your hand and I'll find you. Okay, we'll do here first.
Thank you so much for being here today. I hope somebody thanks you every single day for what you did. I hope somebody thanks you every single day, because standing up there must have been taking so much courage and bravery. So thank you, and I hope every single day for the rest of your life somebody thanks you. Then kind of going towards Professor Cummings' comments and tying it in with your Olympic experience, it seems to me like today's athletes are ridiculed for behavior off the field which doesn't conform to society's expectation. For example, the Redeem team, who had to make up for their behavior at Athens, where they didn't represent America to the considered standards. It seems to me that we focus on that attention, but when our athletes decide to take a stand, it's considered a negative thing, which I think it should be a positive thing. No matter what the viewpoint, it's a positive action. I was just wondering if you could sort of speak about how the Olympic Committee has changed their perspective on athletic protests, or how, their policies have changed. They obviously were very negative against you, and I was wondering if you could talk if that's changed at all.
Well, first of all, from 1968 to roughly 1980, maybe 85, they had whitewashed our history. Not just Tommy Smith and John Carlos, but anyone that was associated with that team as a participant, they whitewashed it. So you sit back and you figure for that 25 years, 23 years or whatever, those individuals didn't have a clue as to what happened in 1968. If you go to school and you pick up a textbook today, you will find that picture in the textbook with that much writing under the picture. But it won't have any explanation as to what this picture is and why it is and why it was necessary and so forth like that. Then at the same time, you take into account that the Olympics is no longer what the Olympics originally was from Pierre Coubertin. Pierre Coubertin said, we concerned about bringing love and harmony and good sportsmanship to all amateur athletes. Well, America is relative to the rest of the world now. Everybody's trying to be a capitalistic society. America is the #1 leader in that. So the Olympic Committee embraced America's values and said, we're no longer concerned about the amateur athlete. We're concerned about bringing about the best athlete. For instance, years ago, it used to be a guy didn't make it to the pros, but he said, well, I made it to the Olympic Games. That's the highlight of my life, to represent the United States in the Olympics from my college career. Now those individuals are taken away where they will never have that opportunity to say, I made the Olympic team, because they've gone to the capital end of it in terms of saying we're bringing the professional athletes in now. So in order for you to get in from college, you have to be an exceptional college student to make that team. Business corporations have put down in small print and say you have to live up to the standards of our ideals. In other words, you have blinders on your eyes. If you see that individual getting kicked in the head, that's not your concern. Your concern is to get in there and play that game and come out and don't be concerned. Whereas years ago, we had a far better understanding as to who we were and the society in which we were living. And our main focus was, how can we make this a more conducive and a cohesive society for all people? I don't think athletes of today even think about that, because they're blinded with the bling-bling, they're blinded with the big rides and the big houses, and all these different shows that they have on TV. It just perpetuates it. You sit back and you think about professional sports today, football, for example. They have 500,000 kids come out of college every year to go to play professional football. Out of 500,000 kids, they take 5,000. All the rest of the 500,000 is beef. Just like Professor Davis said, where the owner call up and say, well, John Carlos busted up his leg. We did the surgery last night. Give him about 8 weeks, and he should be healed. And as soon as the trainer go to the coach and say, well, Carlos is healed. And then he sends one of the assistant coaches in and tell me, say, coach want to see you. I go see the coach, and the coach say, well, John, you know, your running style was great, but it's not conducive to our front line. We're going to have to put you on waivers. But I know somebody in the Washington Redskins organization would love to have you. I'm going to call them and tell them that you're coming over. So consequently, now I busted up my leg. Now I'm getting ready to go bust up my shoulder. And that's what happens with that other 500,000.
Hang on, Richard, hang on just a second. One of the things that I wanted to mention quickly that we were able to talk about a little bit last night is that to the question of activism in athletes today and expectations, we are so engrossed now in the capitalistic endorsement era that athletes, in my opinion, and many that I've talked to, are reticent to take any positions on any subject matter for fear of losing the opportunity to be pursued for endorsements. And in this day and age, when Tiger Woods makes 10 times more on endorsements than he does on what he wins on the golf course, as well as Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, and other athletes, every once in a while, Ira Newble from the Cleveland Cavaliers and now Lakers last year took a pretty aggressive stand on human rights issues on Darfur and tried to get a bunch of NBA athletes to join with him, and so few would, based on this fear that endorsement opportunities will be lost. And I think that's a real difference between what Dr. Carlos, Tommy Smith, and so many athletes did back in the 60s and 70s and what athletes are willing to do today.
My comment to that was, how much money do you have to have in the bank account before you can be a man or a woman? I mean, you sit back and you look at the majority of the athletes that he just mentioned. If they didn't have the athletic ability, the max they might have made in a lifetime might have been $800,000 in a lifetime. Now, here's a guy been playing basketball for like 5 years, and he got $50 million in the bank. I mean, what do you have to have in the bank for you to step up to the plate and say, I'm a man, and I'm a human being that's concerned about humanity? How much money do you have to have before you can cross that line? That's the question.
Like Chelsea, I just want to say thank you for coming. This is a really big event for me, at least, to be able to talk to you all. I have like a million questions, but I'm just going to limit it to 2. I'm pretty nervous, so excuse me for that. But to Professor Davis, I noticed that you were talking about the historical overview of sports and race, and you were talking about how in the slavery era they had the foot races for the slaves at that time, and how that was used to placate, I guess, the potential wants or needs of the slaves at the time. I want to know, would you agree with the fact that in today's era, I guess you probably would, based on the comments so far, that the modern structure of sports is basically just a revamped slavery structure? I mean, in the fact that today's modern-day Super Bowl is just a slavery foot race. I don't know if that's just a comment, but it's a question I have for you. And also for Dr. Carlos, I wanted to ask you to talk about Peter Norman, the Australian sprinter, who was up on the stand with you as well, and your relationship with him, if you don't mind.
I think it's a I disagree with you somewhat, and I'll tell you why. I think that certainly there's this tension that's ever present in sports, and it goes back to what we were talking about before, and that is between being yourself and being an activist and pursuing your livelihood. Because let's face it, the people get paid a lot of money, all right? And for me, but at the same time, and maybe this is where I agree with you, they have to conform. And if you don't conform, and that need to conform actually starts at an early period of time. You won't even make it there if you don't conform to the rules and the structures. If you decide you want to be an activist, let's say in high school, you know, that could end up, the result of that could be you're going to be kicked off the team. So there's this tension, and it's an ever-present tension. And it actually goes back to something that Dr. Cummings talked about, because historically, if you look at it, after sports were reintegrated, one of the tensions was, to what extent are you going to allow African Americans to actually exhibit their creativity, as Bill Rhoden calls it, that particular style that they had. Because on the one hand, owners wanted it. On the other hand, owners didn't want it because they didn't want them to go too far outside the boundaries of what would deem to be acceptable, so as not to turn off white fans. You still see that happening to some extent too. So maybe I agree with you that there is always this need or this sense that you can't go too far and you have to conform. You even see it with respect to the Olympics, and I wanted to mention this with respect to the Olympics, and that is that what you have today is the corporate Olympics. And so in the corporate Olympics, it's not going to condone any type of protest. And also, you can't act in a certain way. The head of the Olympic Committee was critical of Usain Bolt because of his more expressive style of celebration. So, you know, there's that tension there. It's going to continue to be there. So, I mean, I wouldn't go as far to say it's a modern form of slavery, but it does go back to the issue of, as Dr. Carlos mentioned, how much money do you need before you decide that you want to express yourself? So maybe it really comes internally, and that is because I'm not exactly sure, and we talked about this last night. I think money plays a role in it, but money is not the only thing, or the quest for money, or the fear that they'll be cut off from endorsements. I think there's something else that's going on too, which ultimately results in a lack of courage. And where does that start? Does it start through the socialization process when kids are drawn into sports at a very early age? It used to be high school. Now they're being targeted and sort of put on this path in elementary school. All right, and is there a certain socialization that occurs that perhaps that's a form of a slave mentality, if you want to call it that? So I think it's very complex, and there are a lot of different dimensions to it. So that's sort of my long answer to your question, because it is very complex.
Peter Norman. When I met Peter Norman the first time, Peter was just like me, cocky, arrogant, assured of himself and his abilities. So we were two peas in the pipe with friction, rubbing up against one another. But after a while, we've gotten by that, and we got to the point where we said we left the athlete and got involved in who the person is, who the individual is. And Peter was a very genuine individual with his cockiness. Like people say, John Carlos is kind of cocky and arrogant. Well, that's my persona out front. But in the back, I'm a kind, loving guy. And that's the way Peter Norman was. And we locked up pretty well. And when the final race came, and Peter came in and took second in the race. And I remember we ran, and then we went up in the tunnel, and the coach ran up, and he said, well, you got first and second. And I know Peter had beat me. I was a little disappointed. But I told the coach, I said, no, coach. I said, Peter Norman, I believe, took second. If they try and give me second place, I'm going to denounce it. I'm going to give him second place. But when I looked up at the clock and saw that Peter Norman had run 20 flat, there's no white guy in the history before 68 that ever run 20 flat for 200 meters. So quite naturally, I was excited, more excited for Peter Norman and what he had done that day than I was for Tommy Smith or myself. So when the demonstration came about, we was downstairs, and I asked Peter, I said, hey, man, you believe in human rights? And Peter looked at me and he said, what do you mean, blind me? He said, my mom and dad was civil rights, not civil rights, but what do you call them, Salvation Army workers, all of his childhood life. He said, we know everything about civil rights. I said, well, listen, you see this button I'm wearing? I said, it's the Olympic Project for Human Rights. Would you like to wear one of the buttons? And before I could say, boo, he's reaching for mine. I had to get away. You can't have this one. I'll get you one. And as we were marching out, getting ready to go out to the podium, it was a guy named Paul. I can't remember what Paul's last name is, but he was a Harvard rower, one of the rowing team. And they were like hippies at the time. And they was down with the cause, and they was wearing the buttons. I said, Paul, let me have your button. And he looked at me, you got one? I said, man, throw me the button. And he threw me the button, and I took the button, and I pinned it on Peter right there as we was walking through the chute just before we went out. And he put that button on. That made me feel so good, because that make you think, say, hey, man, there are some decent people in the world on the other side of town. So I had a tremendous amount of respect and love for Peter Norman. But never knowing in my wildest dreams, you know, in terms of how deep this thing was going to be after this particular demonstration. I knew they was going to be upset with me, and they was going to be upset with Tommy. But would they be upset with Peter Norman because he put a button on and said Olympic Project for Human Rights? He didn't put his fist to the sky. He didn't give the finger. He didn't say nothing negative. All he did was say, I believe in human rights by wearing that button. Now, in America, when they decided to say, we're going to get due diligence and revenge on these individuals, well, they want to whip up on Tommy Smith. They go whip up on Tommy Smith. Man, I'm tired of beating up on him. Let's go on the other side of town and beat up on John Carlos. So they had time to let us recoup for a minute. But Peter Norman didn't have nobody to give him a break. Australia, at that time in 1968, was like South Africa. Very much so. And when Peter Norman went home, Peter Norman was ostracized. I mean, to the dime, to the day he died. He had a nervous breakdown. They drove him to drink. They broke up his first marriage. Well, they broke up all of our first marriages. But when I went to Peter's funeral, and I stood up to speak, and I made the statement that Peter never flinched. He never hesitated. He never stepped back. He never denounced what we stood for or what he stood for. He steadfast. He took all the beating and the punishment and the ridicule and sucked it up because, John, this is the right thing to do. Now, they built those statues at San Jose State. Let me show you how the character of the man. They built the statues at San Jose State, 20, 25 feet, 30 feet, somewhere around there. Now, they have Tommy Smith, they have me, and where Peter Norman should be is blank. So quite naturally, you know, Peter being my buddy, I went to the president and I said, hey, man, what's going on? Why aren't you guys erecting Peter Norman here? He said, well, John, you know, Peter Norman didn't go to San Jose State. This is San Jose State students raising the money and this, that, and the other. And then the guy that was in charge of the whole program, he pulled me on the side. He said, John, I can tell you, but I want you to go to Peter Norman and talk to him. So I called Peter in Australia. I said to him, I said, Pete, Coach told me I need to call you and ask you about the statues. You know what Peter said to me? He said, John, he said, let me tell you something. He said, you and Tommy, that was your day. I was in support of what you guys were doing that day because I believe in the human race. He said, I preferred not to be on that victory stand there at San Jose State, so anybody and everybody that felt support for you could stand in my spot where I was. And that shows, man, he was a tremendous individual. To just make that statement, I prefer to step back, to let anyone that had the courage to step up and say, I support them. And you know how many people come up to that stadium, not to the stadium, but to the statues, and stand in Peter's spot and take pictures? So Peter will be remembered as long as after I'm dead and gone through my family because they call him Uncle Peter. I call him my brother, and will continue that for eternity. The man, Peter Norman.
Dr. Carlos?
Yes.
I'm 58 years old. I'm a lawyer, college professor, and for the last 40 years, you've been one of my heroes.
Thank you, sir.
I have a question for you and also Professor Davis. During the same Olympic Games, I don't know if you were aware of this, but Dave Waddle won the gold medal in the mile.
72.
72.
Right.
72. And while they played the national anthem, he stood there with his cap on.
Right.
Did you ever hear any fallout from him?
No. double standard, but we had things happen in the 68 games, the girl from Czechoslovakia as well. In terms of what was happening in Czechoslovakia and her making a statement, they didn't care to focus on that. They cared to focus on what we did. But, like, this race game is just like what I said at the end. It's a game. I can't get fired up to the point where I'm got hate and disenchantment and want to get at your throat. All I can do is say, man, that was a great chess move you played. Let me make my move now. Understand? And my move is to try and educate someone to take them to higher ground. We have understanding. I know exactly what you're saying, and I have to deal with that because that is the crux of the problem. They don't see it as a level playing field. And out of circumstance, like, let me give you for instance, Michael Vick. Michael Vick had some dogs, beating them, executing them, fighting one another, and I don't condone nothing that he did. But then, when I saw the outcry from America about what happened with those dogs, and I said, well, when the KKK was hanging and lynching and raping and robbing, how come I didn't see that same outcry? And we're in modern times now. This is not back in 1925 where it was standard. We in the space age, getting ready to go to Mars. But they raised hell about him having some dog fighting. But the minute they stuck that plunger up that man's butt in New York, I didn't hear no outcry. When they put that man in them chains and drug him all through Texas, I didn't hear no outcry when they dismembered his body. So these are the things that I have to be concerned about and put on the forefront. Even on our side of town, we got some people that I'm concerned about, like Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton. I tell them, I say, man, you guys remind me of tow truck drivers. All you do is ride around, wait for some shit to happen so you can be there to get the cameo picture and then take off. Okay? And they get mad at me because I be telling the truth. I say, man, don't be trying to pimp here. Run your game somewhere else. But this is quite evident. With Obama running for president, they all went and sat down real quiet because they showed their cards too early. Now they say, we might have to leave the country. But until we get these things to the point where we understand, say, man, I don't have no dislove for people that's prejudiced because a lot of times people are prejudiced based on ignorance. Okay? Like they taught this. And then in the corporate world, greed takes place too. Like I ask guys, I say, man, when you're in the corporate office, and they're using ethnic jokes. I said, you sit there and skin and grin when they talking maybe about your mama or your daughter? I said, do you step up to the plate? And I say, and what I can determine what's happening in society is by what you did behind that door in that corporate office. And they look at me, well, what do you mean? I mean that when my man bit the sandwich and told you, say, hey, eat this, and you tell him, I'm not hungry, he said, eat it anyway, and you suck down and eat it. I said, it makes me think that when they drew up the board and said, we're going to start redevelopment in America. I remember in 1955, when white flight took place in New York. And all the white folks had said, too many domesticated people coming into Harlem, let's go. So they took off. And now here we are in 2008, and the gas is like crazy high. And that same black guy in the corporate office sitting there and they showing the blueprint. I said, man, did you have the basketballs to step up to the plate and say, well, what's going to happen to these people when you move them out? If I'm paying $600-700 a month rent and living there for the last 50 years, and then you come tell me about you moving me out for redevelopment, and knowing, you'll be able to get your apartment back when you come back. Only difference is now you have to pay $3,600 opposed to $600. I said, did you step up to the plate then, or did you just keep your mouth shut like when they was giving the jokes off? So these are the situations that we're in terms of trying to make people look at themselves in terms of saying, man, if you lose this job, you was looking for a job when you found out. I got to live with me. I got to be able to go home and look at my kid. When I get ready to leave this world, my kid can say, man, my daddy didn't leave nothing unturned for me. I believe in hard work, and I believe in being compensated for your work. When you look at the college institutions right now, like professional sports, what Professor Davis was talking about, think about this. Think about Kareem Abdul-Jabbar going to UCLA. 4 years. Kareem got a scholarship. The scholarship was worth, maybe at the time he went, probably about $30,000. Okay? But think about how many TV contracts came to UCLA to film Kareem's games. Every time they came, they got $1 million. 4 times, 4 years, $1 million for every time they signed that contract. Think about how many jerseys they sold with his number and his name on it. Think about how many hot dogs and how many Coca-Colas they sold. And not to mention, that's just basketball. We didn't even get to the football stadium yet. So some people tell me, say, well, John, it's an even shake. How's it even shake? Because you gave me a $30,000 scholarship and you walked away with $150 million? How's that even? But see, I'm not supposed to talk about that. You know? And these are things that we need to discuss. Ain't no need to get mad about it. But we need to discuss it and make them understand. Say, man, I'm not satisfied with what you bring to the table. I'm out there, got my kid going to school, and I'm trying to push him to get his education. But you making money.
Professor Davis, in your presentation, you were talking about sports being a microcosm of the larger society. With the visibility of sports stars and entertainers who are black who are making big bucks, do you think that creates a problem for the rest of the black society because the general white population think we've made it because they see these high-profile blacks?
Yeah, I think it does, actually. And that's one of the, what could be viewed as being one of the negative aspects of success on the entry level. And it even with respect to sports, people see the success of black players and conclude that there's no problem within sports with respect to race or any type of barriers that persist to achievement on the part of blacks in sports moving up to management. But as far as society overall, I'm not really sure because I think people recognize that, or I shouldn't say recognize, at least should be smart enough to recognize that that is just a small subset of the population. But perhaps it gives some people some comfort in thinking, well, you know, we have these entertainers and athletes who make it, so perhaps that means that all barriers have been removed in other aspects of society. So I think for some people that could very well be true, but I'm not sure I would be willing to extrapolate it that far. To say that people conclude that there are not barriers in society because they see the success of athletes. I think they believe that with respect to athletics itself. Many people do. Sure.
I'd like to just add a little bit to that. When you sit back and you think about whether we successfully have made it as black people, you think about the Huxtables come on TV. I mean, they tried and stigmatized everybody. So they made it. Look at Bill Cosby. Look how they live. Like they gave the impression that all black people was living that way. You know, in 1968, Oprah Winfrey wasn't on TV. Oprah Winfrey got her birth as a result of Tommy Smith and John Collins. But in retrospect, now you sit back, I can't even get Oprah Winfrey to invite me to her show. Stand for a fear that I might stigmatize her. But then you sit back and you think about when they started focusing on the criminal element in the street within the environment of the black community or minority community. And then what did they do? When they started sending them to jail, you know, 3 strikes, you're out, they sent them to jail. What's the first thing they did on TV? They put Judge Mathis, Judge Maybelline. This judge, every movie you saw was a black judge to make you feel good about going to jail because the black judge is sending you to jail. So they can paint the picture any way they want to paint the picture. It's just a matter of making sure that we educate our folks enough or arouse them enough where they say, I can start to read between the lines now.
Yeah, if I could just add one thing to that. I think perhaps more than looking at black entertainers and sports figures and saying that means that, you know, barriers have been removed in the rest of society, what the larger society is more likely to do is to look at their behaviors and draw inferences from their behaviors. And if you see a rap star acting in a certain way, say, well, that's how black folks act. You know, I think there's more of that going on than drawing conclusions about open access and things of that nature. Pulling particularly some of the more, what could be viewed as some of the more negative behaviors and drawing conclusions and creating assumptions about that.
I wanted to briefly run with something that Dr. Carlos just said. I'm not sure, in listening to John, I'm not sure that he realized what this was going to become, how it was going to blow up, and how it was going to impact his life and change things. And I want to make a couple of comments about that in a minute. But I have a new phrase running through my mind right now, which is we all have John Carlos moments in our own lives. Think the last month of some racist, despicable comment you heard said in your presence. Or think of some unfairness that's occurred that you've recognized. Peggy Cooper calls it microaggressions. But think about a time just in the last few weeks, and how did you react to that? How did you respond to it? I was out at dinner with my little family a few nights ago, and an older server made an extremely racist comment while we were sitting there at dinner. And how do you respond? What do you do with your John Carlos moment? I think that's what Dr. Carlos was just talking about. How do you stand up and say, that is unacceptable? I will not stand for that comment, which is, the woman was, I felt sorry because she was serving and she must have been in her 70s or something. But I said, you know what, what you said is completely racist and unacceptable. And you said it in front of my 6-year-old son. I can't have that. You can't have that. And she was taken aback, and it was uncomfortable for all of us. But what are you going to do with those moments? And I think we all have an opportunity, maybe not at this level, but we have an opportunity in our lives almost daily to stand up and say, this is what I'm going to do for my own social justice and my own conscience and for what's right. And, I don't know that there's a greater embodiment of that in the world than what Tommy Smith and John Carlos did. Now, two anecdotal comments quickly. You see the buttons that these three are wearing that Dr. Carlos talked about, Peter Norman wear. If you want to watch that clip again that we showed earlier, it's on YouTube. And one of the things that I think is outstanding is that John Carlos wore that button in his races. If you watch the race, you'll see, I'm sure some athletes would think that might slow me down 1/zillionth of a second in wearing that button. But for John, this wasn't about a publicity stunt or a moment. It was for real. And also for real that he hasn't talked about is he shared with us last night that the FBI followed him around for years after he returned to the United States. And when he says they broke up his first marriage, they did. They brought pictures of him talking at campuses with women surrounding him, and they'd go to his wife and say, your husband's sleeping with all of these women in this picture, whom he'd met briefly in a passing moment after speaking at a particular event. And so we're talking about having the courage to stand up in real moments, to do real, solid social justice work if you can, and you have opportunities to do them. Think about it. They occur all the time.
Yeah, I was just thinking when you was talking about my wife. My first wife, it was such a strain on her until she just couldn't take it no more and took her life. I sit back and I think about that. I get emotional about that. And think about it, the time when it happened. My kids were young, and I'm dealing with the government, and I'm dealing with trying to keep my family together as best I could, and then trying to deal with the emotion of my kids of losing their mom and not being able to understand. Like my kids right now, my daughter in that video up there, they tell me now in their adulthood, Daddy, how come you didn't tell us all these things? And, my answer to them is simple. It was my job to protect you, to keep you safe, to keep you strong, and to keep you focused. It wasn't my place at that time to tell you. And in time, history would tell you. So all the time things was going on. I used to wake my kids up at night and tell my kids, go get your clothes out the dresser drawer, and then I'd go in the room with a claw hammer and start banging the furniture up. And my wife thinking that I'm crazy. And it's about the fact that I didn't have money to pay my electric bill. So if I didn't have no electric, I didn't have no heat. In the winter months, it get cold, you got to use this to figure out how am I going to survive through this. And I had to explain to my wife, I said, we can get some new furniture. I said, but it's not that simple if one of our kids died because of pneumonia or what have you. So I have to do what I have to do. Like to take $100 and tell somebody, say, man, let me hustle some more money. Let's take this $100 and drive from LA to Vegas just so I can roll the dice. I'm a good crapshooter. But I did what I had to do. And then at the same time, think about this. I come out of Harlem, they say, the hard streets of New York. Well, I know about gangsterism. I know about these little Punks that think they gangsters, they ain't no gangsters. I know about the real gangsters. You think they didn't come to me and tell me, they said, Johnny, why are you living like this, man? You don't have to live like this. Come on, get back with us. And I had to push off from them and tell them, say, hey, man, this is bigger than you, it's bigger than us. I said, for what I stand for now, I can never go back and do the things that you asked me to do, because it's about what I stand for and what I want my kids to believe in. It's easy for me to go out there and get in the streets and make a whole bunch of money. It's just like Dr. King. When Dr. King was getting subsistence from people who were sending money from all over the country, and Dr. King kept taking the money and putting the money into the program, and Coretta had a big concern. Well, why are we living the way we live with all this money coming in? And Dr. King said, this money is not for us. We living good by the grace of God. And that's the way I look at where I live. And he said, this money is for these other people. What I do most time, I do it with my palms open like that. Because it ain't about me. God takes care of me every day. It's about those that haven't been taken care of and don't know what it means to be taken care of. It's about those that you're trying to raise up. Last thing I want to say, when I met Dr. King, after the meeting, Dr. King was going to come out and be second in command for the boycott. And he said, if I get back from Memphis. So at the end of the meeting, I asked him, I said to him, well, he asked me, he said, do you have any questions? I said, I got 2 questions. I said, what do you mean, if you get back from Memphis? And everybody know he went to Memphis the first time, everything was cool. Well, it wasn't really cool, but he went anyway. And when he said to me, he said, well, John, he said, I have to go to Memphis and stand for those that can't stand for themselves. I have to go to Memphis and stand for those that won't stand for themselves. That said volumes to me. Because when I thought about the sanitation department in Memphis, Tennessee, there wasn't all black sanitation workers. Across the board. Every ethnic group was in the sanitation department. Then I asked him, I said to him, I said, now, what you mean if you get back? He told me, he said, they had sent me a letter, and they told me in this letter, they have a bullet with my name on it, and I won't have to wait long. And I always wear shades all the time, and I have my glasses down. I don't want to look through the shades, I'm going to look through over. And I'm looking dead up in his eyes. And everybody could pretty much know what I was looking for. I'm looking for that fear factor. My man was 30 as a rock. So when I went to Mexico City and got on that victory stand, everything that Dr. King gave to me ran through my body. The vision that I had was a kid, that's the first thing that came to me. I said to myself, excuse my expression, oh shit, that's what that vision was about. Because all my life, from the time I was 7 to 8 years old, I'm trying to figure out, why did God come to me with this vision? And what is this all about? And when I got in that victory stand, everything that I saw as a little baby in that vision, it scared me to death, where everybody started booing and throwing and sissing. That's exactly what happened on that victory stand. So they ain't like, you out there by yourself. When you take a step, you got power around you don't even know about. And it's about weathering the storm. It's about saying, like Peter Norman said, I'm not going to flinch, I'm not going to hesitate, I'm not going to back away, and I'll release them all. I'm not going to turn away and walk away from it. Yes, hard, but it's going to be hard in order to make it a better world for everybody. You step up and think about the war right now. Think about all those young individuals that's supposed to be sitting in these vacant seats right now. That died, and then years down the line, when we start turning the pages back, and we're never going to be able to come to a conclusion as to why those individuals are not here now. Because we choose to sit back. We see a cluster of people get out and say, I'm against the war. And it's a lot of people that be in their household and feel the same way. But they don't have the power in the heart. They don't have the heart to get up and denounce what's going on.
I think we have time for one final question.
Good afternoon. I would like to say thank you, not just on behalf of myself, but on behalf of my university, on behalf of my family who experienced that with you. I want to say thank you for taking that time that day, and whether you saw it as a personal sacrifice or not, it was, and you did it for a lot more than just yourself. So I say thank you on behalf of, again, myself and everyone else. Thank you for the panel for coming up today and sharing. A lot of times we have information and we don't share it, and it's then useless. So thank you for making it useful. One comment I do want to make, so many, but I'll try to condense it all into one statement in question. Professor Davis had on his slide, I think it was the last slide, the issue of education for our collegiate athletes. And we went into the conversation of, I guess, the responsibilities our collegiate and then professional athletes take today, personal sacrifices or stands that they take or choose not to take. I think the level of education, I guess I would say, quote unquote, in the streets that they have right now is not the same in 1968. And then I look at the level of education that they're afforded in college. I think it's slim to none. As Professor Cummings had mentioned in his opening, we have hope because there's progress made. Yes, in numbers, I do believe there's progress made, but in going to another comment by Professor Davis, the physical contributions that our athletes made in the days when they were enslaved, and even after that, I think is still here today. These athletes are put on the field, punt in on purpose, on the field to exhibit their physical strengths. The mental abilities of these men and women are great, but they're not encouraged. What do we do for our collegiate, and I mean even before college, but in this case collegiate athletes, to help educate them in a holistic way? So when they become professional athletes, whether it's on the NBA, with the NBA, NFL, or even on the Olympic stage, where they can feel that they have the ability to make a stand, where it's not about the quote-unquote bling, or where bling is then redefined for them. What do we do, or how would you, I guess, address that issue?
I mean, I think it's one of the most difficult issues, and it really goes back in a sense to the comment about the slavery, because it's, if anything, it's more of a mental slavery and a mindset, and it's the socialization that occurs. I'll give an example. Athletes are oftentimes discouraged from participating in a larger university, and I don't think that's by accident. It's so that the athletic departments could exert control. Well, that happens at a very early age. And the simplest solution to that is for parents not to get caught up in that socialization themselves. Whether it's a single parent or dual family household, they have to educate their children and educate them about the system that they become a part of. And certainly there are things that can be done. I know that Professor drawing a blank here, Brooks on the undergraduate campus teaches the sports sociology course, and I think he addresses these issues to try to educate people. I don't know how many athletes take that course. It would be a good thing for athletes to take that course. So there are possibilities and resources there, but it's about getting them to that and affording them access to, encouraging them to take advantage of those things. But I really think it begins at home. I really do, because the schools simply are not going to do it. The schools are not going to do it. They're not, I mean, even beyond athletics, schools are not teaching the type of history where individuals could be holistic individuals, all right? And so that's where the responsibility, I'm a parent of a 12-year-old. We are educating her in addition to the education that she's receiving in school. But unfortunately, the problem with that is that many of the athletes, I find it very interesting. I read, subscribe to ESPN magazine. One of the reasons I do that is because my students expect that I should stay attuned to what's happening in sports. I mean, so I'd say, well, I'm obligated to do it. But the other thing is periodically, and quite often, they will have stories about athletes, particularly black athletes, and a lot of black athletes still come from environments where they don't have access to a lot of money. I mean, single parents, and they come from households where parent may have been on drugs or that sort of thing. So the problem with saying it starts with the households, that the people who are providing them with their guidance may not be prepared to teach them all that they have to teach them. And so, maybe since that's the case, it will just involve more activist individuals in the community to try to see that occurs, because it is a real tough issue. And I don't know what the answer to it is. I really don't. But I recognize the symptom and the manifestation of the problem of this a very narrow education that athletes receive, which I think, and it's something that we had talked about last night, I think the money is a part of it, why they're not more activists in it, or don't have more of an activist, or even beyond activists, or short of being an activist, just more of a political mindset. But I think it's a lot more than that. It's a socialization process that occurs, and it occurs at a very early age. Read an article which talked about how, and the author of the article, it was in Sports Illustrated, talked about how, and it was with some surprise, that athletes have become more vocal with respect to the current election, presidential election, voicing support for either Senator Obama or Senator McCain. And I thought, well, maybe this is a positive sign. Maybe it's a positive sign. But on the other hand, is that taking so much of a risk? I mean, you have the two presidential candidates for a party. But at the same time, it's something that they've tended to shy away from in the past, even at that level, which I don't consider it very risky to endorse one candidate versus the other. So it is a problem developing a more politically aware mindset for these athletes. But it goes back, and I have to borrow your term, it goes back to whether or not the athletes are being educated in a more holistic sense, and they're not.
I'd just like to jump on that for just a moment and say that I think it's really, really important that forums like this one today are held and athletes are invited and individuals are given the opportunity. So many institutions shy away from the hard discussions. And this is re-examining race in sports. I have to give credit, once again, to the Sports Entertainment Law Society, to Bethany, Rob, Andrew, Aaron, JJ, Brian, Sheila, Kimberly, who pushed this forum together and created at least an environment where folks could get invited to come and talk about tough issues. And I think it's extremely important to bring together people that are not afraid to talk about the hard issues. Certainly, Dr. John Carlos is not afraid to talk about the hard issues. Certainly, Professor Tim Davis is not afraid to talk about the hard issues. And I find in academia many individuals are. They don't want to talk about race. They don't want to talk about poverty. They don't want to talk about class. And this is really important. And let me also use this moment for a small commercial. In February, the same organization is going to do a symposium on hip-hop's influence on law and culture. So keep your eye open for what we hope to be. Maybe Dr. Carlos and Professor Davis know a little bit about hip-hop, so they might want to come back. But we're determined to talk about the hard issues on this campus, by this society, and we reach out all the time to the athletes here to try and get them to come and educate themselves as to the issues that impact and face them now.
Thank you for all of your questions. That concludes our program for today. How about another round of applause for our panelists?
Just real quick, sorry, 10 more seconds of your time before, because Dr. Carlos has to go to the bathroom also. We have, as we do for all of our special speakers at the law school, Professor Davis and Dr. Carlos, we have boxes of Mountaineer statues for you. Look like this. We've got them boxed up for you to take home to remember your time here at the law school. So, and thank you again for coming.
I want to personally thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, bro.